Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. First there was Magic Johnson, then there was Mitchell Johnson. Well, these are people who are not British, but I just like the sound of Johnson. And now we have Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Wales and Scotland. I hope I'm getting it right. I don't know if I missed out some territory. But be that as it may, we reach out to Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma, our resident fellow Virat Hindustan Sanghi based out of London, on his thoughts on what this new prime ministership means to the people of Great Britain, to the people of India, to the world at large, because England is going through a particularly difficult time in its passage, in its history, whatever you want to call it, thanks to the confusion of Brexit. No matter how you flip, I mean, May tried really, really hard, but May gave up at the end of May, I suppose. Sorry, pardon the pun. But let's reach out to Panditji. Panditji, welcome to PGurus channel.
Sri Ayerji, it's an absolute pleasure as always to be with you, especially on what is here in the UK, the hottest day ever in England. I've just been in the House of Commons earlier on today, and the temperature there was also very, very hot. So it's a pleasure to be speaking to our transatlantic friends on this subject, on this incredible subject.
Yes, it is hot across the pond here too. We're used to earth-shaking events, but we're not used to weather-shaking events in the Californian coast. But be that as it may, viewers, please do not forget to click on our subscribe button. This has become a favorite request of mine. We are slowing down. We would like to gallop again in our subscriptions, because then we can do more quality programming. More people will believe in us. Right now, Panditji has an implicit faith that I'm doing a decent job at what I'm doing. So, Panditji, take it away. How did events lead up to this? To Boris coming to power?
Brexit, shall we?
Yes.
Here in the UK for the last 3 years, this has been the one subject which all the radio stations have talked about every day. It's been on television every day. All of parliamentary activity effectively ground to a halt because this one issue was consuming everything. Now, 3 years ago, if I can just wind the clock back.
Absolutely, absolutely, sure.
I was asked to participate in a panel session on the subject of Brexit and what the Indian community, the British diaspora, Indian diaspora community were thinking about Brexit. Now, at that time, I stuck my neck out and said, Brexit's going to happen. I wasn't comfortable and confident enough as to give a judgment as to whether it was going to be good or whether it was going to be bad. But the mood from the grassroots was that the average person on the street had had enough of this European relationship. I think the sentiment, there's in the British character, there is a rejection of domination, a rejection of an overlord of control. It's a rebelliousness that's built in. And I think over the last few decades, 30 years or so, it had been building up that we're not actually being allowed the freedom to express our own vision and express our own choice of direction. So this was palpable in the country. This was palpable at the grassroots, the people on the street. This was very, very predictable. So that was the proposition I put forward at the interview. And I remember the horror with which everybody said, no, 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 you must be joking. It would be the most terrible thing. It can't happen. But that was only a few days before the Brexit vote eventually was taken on January the 23rd, 2016. June the 23rd. And when the result was announced a day or so later, everybody was pretty much in shell shock. The bubble within which Westminster conducts its business, the political elite as they're called, the political elite and the bubble over in the EU, both of those bubbles just couldn't understand, they couldn't compute how did this happen, what was the driver behind it. It was completely outside of all of their plans. And at that moment in time, it's almost as though Britain entered like a ship crossing the Atlantic into fog, and the political class completely lost sight of all vision and direction. And today in Parliament, it really felt as though actually the ship was coming out of that fog, at last there was somebody who, whether you like him or you dislike him, whether the decision is right or wrong, at least a decision had been made. It was a decision consistent with what the voting electorate had said we want to do. And so all of a sudden now, it seemed as though that was disappearing. In Parliament, there are two sides now. Most of the opposition benches were sitting shell-shocked, stunned at the performance of Boris Johnson. Their Dawn Butler, who's one of the front bench on the opposition, she sat through most of the talk with her hands, her head in her hands, in disbelief as to how did this happen. But the really positive thing about it is that all of a sudden we've got somebody, like him or not, who seems to have a vision, and he's quite enthusiastic about articulating his vision. And that enthusiasm, that clarity, which says, this is what we're going to do, we're going to be successful at it. And I think that too is probably the newest ingredient on the parliamentary scene. So it's added a whole new experience of energy and of purpose and of drive that has been lacking for the last 3 years. If you were wandering around Parliament, on occasion it just seemed like people were confused and without direction. That, I think, has changed.
Now, Boris Johnson has roots that date back to many countries, right? Turkey, India, and a few others. Now, what is it that Boris brings to the table that Theresa May could not? I'm just looking for that differentiation.
The thing that I've noticed, and I've met Boris on a couple of occasions, the thing that I've noticed is that he's actually more of a world traveller.
Mm-hmm.
He's certainly have a much broader experience set and vision than some of the conventional British politicians. On occasion, British politicians have been accused of a little islander mentality, and we do see that from time to time rearing its head. Now, Boris doesn't have that, and if you have a look at the manner in which he's peopled his cabinet, you can see that he has got what appears to be a game plan. He's focused on the merits of the people involved and the skill set that they can bring to it, and he has completely tossed out of the window any notion of what the cabinet should look like and what it could look like. It's almost like a CEO has stepped in with a list of tasks and specific objectives, populated irrespective of where a person came from, his cabinet, and has now got his working team in place. The broadcasters are saying that this was the most brutal culling of cabinet members they've ever seen. I think some 18 people have been removed from the upper echelons of the number 10, and a whole new wave have come in. And he has picked some people who ordinarily wouldn't have ticked the boxes of what a British cabinet minister should look like in the old way of doing things. But you can see that there is a spark of creativity in his selection, and that the people he has chosen, I'm fairly confident are going to have a very, very good, maybe interesting, maybe creative contribution to make.
Perhaps you could share a couple of such choices and why you think that could be beneficial for Great Britain. Because I think our viewers kind of know what's happening in England, but I'd just like to kind of, these days we are getting bombarded by news cycles. It's always helpful to go back and look at, why you think some of the picks are interesting and why they're promising.
Yeah, well, there was a phenomenon that happened when Parliament went into paralysis in 2016. And that was that it almost seemed like Theresa May closed the windows, battened down the hatches, became besieged by this one problem. And so the vision of the whole of the government seemed to shrink and become very introverted, very defensive. Now, what Boris, as I mentioned, he has a much broader view. Your viewers may know this, they may not, but when Modiji was in Gujarat as chief minister, Boris actually visited him in Gujarat, going that far back. And that was at a time when the Labour Party and some of the British parliamentarians had fought to have a visa ban put into place against Modiji, and that was still in place. But even at that time, Boris and the people who were around him were aware that there are changes afoot, and he visited Modiji in Gujarat. So we're dealing with somebody whose vision is a lot broader, and so he's been able to break this notion, this idea that we have to be in defence. That's the first thing that's happened. Now, if you look at who he's chosen, there's, well, obviously the biggest name as far as our community is concerned is probably Priti Patel. And when she was a minister in Theresa May's government, development ministry, she was very actively engaged in the India-British relationship. And so her resurfacing and reappearance on the scene really emphasizes the importance with which I think Boris has deemed the Indo-British relationship.
Quick question for you. Didn't she quit the Theresa May government on some grounds?
Well, I think a resignation appeared because there was an accusation of irregularities. She and her family were on vacation in Israel. And at that time, meetings occurred, and members of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office put forward the proposition that these were unauthorized meetings and that they were done in secret. And I think a Sir Humphrey character somewhere in the background.
Viewers, I have to explain the Sir Humphrey character here. Do watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. These episodes are available on YouTube. They came about 30 years ago, but I think these things best describe not just the parliamentary functioning in the parliamentary democracy that exists in the United Kingdom, but also in India. It is very important, a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor, but it gives you a wealth of information. Sorry for that segue, please continue.
And so I think Sir Humphrey at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office suddenly decided that this was an opportunity, and political advantage was sought as opposed to perhaps doing the right thing. And we've often asked the question, how is it possible for a Minister of State to be in somewhere like Israel, surrounded by her own security team, and the rest of the government offices, especially the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, supposedly not know about these meetings? But there were inconsistencies about what happened, but she, as they say, she took one for the team and resigned and retired to the backbenches. But there was always a feeling that it wasn't quite what had been publicly portrayed. And her reappearance on the scene, I think, confirms that it wasn't a question of a loss of integrity or a question mark over character or anything along those lines, but some sort of internal bureaucratic kerfuffle, if I can use one of the popular words in politics these days.
Yes, my favorite was the one about the naming conventions on the channel and a diplomatic incident, I believe is the name of the title of that episode. To me, that was the single best episode in Yes Prime Minister. I'm not going to bat for it. Nobody paid me to say this thing. I just felt that the humor dished out was of the top class. So Satish ji, now Preeti Patel is now home.
Before you move on,
yes,
I have a hope that members of the MEA will be watching this at some point in time, and I would strongly recommend that if they're going to be interacting and engaging with the British establishment and government, then they should make it compulsory to watch Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister. And if at the end of it they come out with shock, horror and disbelief and a total lack of comprehension, that would be an excellent education for them. So I would strongly recommend that. I'm sorry, you were about to say.
Yes, so I mean, I can safely tell you that members of the bureaucracy in India do watch our videos, because I think we provide something out of the left field, as we Yanks like to say. And I don't know the equivalent in cricket, because everything is okay, maybe outside the boundary lines, whatever. So
left of field is how they describe it.
Yes, yes. Now, so Preeti Patel is going to be the Minister of Home, right? Equivalent.
Yes, she's taking over from the department which Theresa May ran.
Oh, okay, okay.
The Home Office is one of the most important and one of the most critical portfolios. A huge amount of responsibility attached to it, and so there's certainly a recognition that Preeti Patel has been entrusted with a very, very key portfolio. Crime, you may have heard, but in London there seems to be a bit of a crime wave going on. Lots of other issues to do with the internal politics, the manner in which voting occurs. You know how in India, Dr. Swamiji especially was responsible for introducing the EVMs and the VVPAT systems.
That's right.
That there was no possibility of voter fraud. Whereas here in the UK, we had an election only very recently, and the allegations of people misusing voter records and all sorts of manipulation seem to have been supported with evidence. So that is also part of her portfolio, and we're all hoping that she may even move towards introducing a voter ID system, photo ID or something along those lines. So those areas are vital to the day-to-day running of the country itself. So that's a very important endorsement for her. And it's often seen as a bit of a stepping stone to future potential prime ministerial appointments.
I take it she's born in England, right?
She is.
Okay.
She is a British-born, Indian origin Hindu, I believe.
Oh, wonderful. So if this does happen, Satish Sharma ji called it first at PGurus channel. Mark our words here. Now, so one suggestion, we always give unasked for advice. I mean, we've been dispensing this free advice to the Indian government. Let me give one to the British government. The British government has endorsed the blockchain as a technology. Perhaps voting can be done on blockchain. You can vote from the comfort of your home. You can vote using a smartphone, and you can vote as many times as you want. The last one that you cast is the one that is taken as your vote before the counting starts. This is a phenomenal thing. In fact, you might even get your own track record of how many times you changed your mind on a one particular election. It's beautiful. It cannot be damaged. It cannot be changed. It can be bulletproof. If the UK wants to go and establish a voter ID system, I would say do use the retinal biometric, because that doesn't change for your life, and also use blockchain. Not very expensive for a country of United Kingdom size. I'm sorry, I like blockchain. I would like to see that in everything. And that was my 2 cents on that. So please continue.
Well, if I can just pick that point up, there is something quaint and quintessentially British about having piles of paper being brought in boxes into a church hall, and then people sort of stumbling around until 4 a.m. counting them and disputing them, and then dispensing with the ones which have got nasty comments on. So that would be part of the British character, I think, compromised by just going to double click. But one thing is certain, and that is that Boris is very much technocrat. He certainly believes that technology should be wielded wherever it can be. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if moves in that direction were to become part of a portfolio. I know that technology is very important to this new team. Another interesting aside is that Britain at this moment has been in the sort of doldrums for almost 3 to 5 years. And the economy since Brexit has been pottering along. Some people say that the improvement in the economy is because the government hasn't been interfering. It's been sidetracked by the Brexit. But there is another issue, and that is that Boris seems to have selected people who are first or second generation immigrant family. They're all very close to him. And so it seems it could be a strategically very sound move that you have people whose character has been molded by the confidence that immigrants have, the can-do attitude that wherever we're going to go, we're going to make a go of it. Whatever happens, we will work hard. We will put in the 7-day weeks. We'll work 24 hours a day. We'll educate our children by teaching them multiplication tables around the breakfast table. But we will push and push and push. And that's why the British Indian community, for example, is only 2% of population, but 6% contributors to GDP. And so there is a possibility that this has been factored in, that we need to get more people who have got that immigrant entrepreneurialism around them to be able to jump in, roll their sleeves up and say, actually, we're going to move things forward, and we'll do it with creativity, and we'll do with it a very dharmic ethos of integrated, non-violent, fully dynamic engagement. So that was another aside which I thought might be an interesting segue to the choice of people he surrounded himself with.
Absolutely. So what is Boris's approach to Brexit going to be?
The million-dollar question. Firstly, some of us remember the Britain prior to it going into Brexit and into Europe. And if you look at some of the YouTube videos now, which are actually published about the speeches that were made at that time, there was a parliamentarian called Peter Shaw. He did a phenomenal speech. If you look at the speeches at that time, then you get a sense of why a section of the population actually feel that Europe has not delivered the promise that was made and sold to the British people. And so Boris, I think, his family as well, they're from the group of people who recognize that that was a major a diversion in British destiny. And so they want to bring it back to the stage where, well, we've been wandering around in this fuzzy Europe thing, spending lots of money, not getting particularly a huge amount of benefit in terms of financial stability, security. The economy has been fairly flat for a long period of time. So the justification for being in Europe, in terms of Boris and the team around him, is not nearly as strong as it used to be. And so I'm fairly confident that he has said that the end of October will be the date when Britain will no longer participate. One of the good things about his approach, though, has been a very realistic understanding to how negotiation occurs. Now, if you think back to the strategy that our mothers used to use when they went to Karol Bagh in Delhi to buy saris, right? There was always the threat that, no, I'm not happy with this sari, I'm not happy with your prices, I'm getting up and I'm leaving. And inevitably, the sari salesperson would come up and say, "Nahi, nahi, aunty ji, please, how can I give you some fizzy drinks, or can I get Roshindi Kulfi from the hatti around the corner for you?" And that's how negotiation occurs. But the Theresa May government seemed to have not understood that that was a fundamental part of it. So Boris's approach is, we're ready to leave. We will cope. We're a nation that has had a great deal of dynamism in its history, even though some of it was questionable history, as you know from the articles that I've written. But there is that dynamism which says we'll be okay. And if we leave at the end of October, no big deal. We'll just go out and do what we need to do. We'll support each other and we'll be all right. Now, that approach is a new and refreshing approach. So I think there's every possibility that if the new European Commission appointees don't come forward and say, let's have some sort of agreement, then 31st of October, Halloween, it will be a new world, and Britain will not be part of the European Union.
Well, to be fair, I mean, they never adopted the euro. They stuck with the pound. So at least currency-wise, that's not going to make a change. However, I'm struck by one thing that I've seen over the years, Panditji. One is that if you go to Goa during, like, after November up until like March, April timeframe, you see a lot of these chartered aircraft coming in from Europe, Paris and London. People come and spend about 3 to 4 to 6 months. I mean, and they are so much domesticated with the Indian conditions. I mean, I've seen them riding scooters. They would stop by, drink water from the tap, and I'll be mortified. I'll be like, no, 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 I want my bottled water. So my point in saying all this is that many Europeans have kind of, they have exchanged a slower, more satisfying lifestyle for being in pursuit of, riches, for lack of a better word. So, the vacation times in Europe are a little bit longer. In fact, there's also another one that I've seen. This is a program that I've heard over NPR, wherein a lot of Britishers have either bought up property in Spain and in Mediterranean coast, and they were in turn, because of there was a rise in real estate in United Kingdom over the last several years. Maybe it's now kind of tapered off, but that money was getting reinvested into Spain. So my point of saying all this is that today the citizen is far more global than local. So this Brexit, essentially, what exactly does it mean that UK wants to stay outside of EU? Did the Britishers feel like they were handling more of the European burden, which is why they wanted to out?
I think it was a combination of factors, really. If I can pick up on your point about the European identity.
Yeah.
If you cast your mind back, there was a time when most of the European countries were engaged in colonialism.
Right.
Colonies, most of Europe was constructed on the wealth that was acquired, in inverted commas,
right.
from colonies. And even to this day, many European countries derive a great deal of revenue. France from the African continent, they're still being paid for the benefit of having granted freedom to Congo, for example. So there is still an element of colonialism very present in the relationship which Europe has with a lot of former colonies. Now, this is unsustainable. And we're also in a world where the colonies are learning to articulate the trauma that was inflicted upon them by colonial rule. And so if you look at it from that panoramic view, we see that what happened is that when the colonies no longer could be maintained and power and authority was disappearing, the colonial nations came back to Europe and they created a fortress Europe. They created an economic zone into which raw materials will be pulled in at the lowest possible prices, goods would be processed, and those goods would then be sold back to the colonies at much, much inflated prices. And this happens today. If you look at the coffee crops from Africa, it's over 100 billion US dollar market globally, the coffee, cocoa plants, and yet only 2% is ever repatriated back to the whole of Africa. So there are lots and lots of endemic inbuilt injustices which are going to be working their way through the global economy. It's only a question of time before the former colonies come back to Europe and they say, right, we want reparations, whether they're soft power reparations or hard power reparations. We want Fortress Europe, the walls to come down. Europe is going, as an identity, I feel, it's been like an eggshell. Whilst Europe existed as an economic community, it prevented the repetitive wars that seem to plague this Euro-Christian corner of the world. At least the European project has stopped that. Hopefully now there is sufficient civilizational maturity that when this eggshell surrounding and protecting Europe breaks, the people themselves will actually be much more globalized citizens who will look back on the colonial past of their countries and say, we have to dismantle the systems of colonialism which are still in place, and we have to engage with the rest of the world on a much less supremacist basis than we have done in our history. So in that backdrop, against that backdrop, if you look at the British, they have an uncanny knack, shall we say, a stroke of luck which says, hang on, this ship is sinking, right? We do not want to go down with this ship. We can see the writing on the wall. We can see the direction this is going in. We're going to leap overboard first and save our own tiny little lifeboat, and we will thrive and prosper. Now, that is an analysis of what is going on a much larger geopolitical scale. It could well be that. Now, in that scenario, the people of all of these various countries are beginning to learn the truth about their colonial history, and they are not happy. In Europe, in Britain, we have seen lots of protests against Cecil Rhodes, statues of him outside Oxford University. People have demanded that those statues of racist, bigoted, colonialist supremacists be completely removed, or they should identify exactly what their crimes against humanity were. And this is happening not just here. In South Africa, we have Julius Malema demanding that land should be taken from white settlers without reparations. So there is a big impetus and a big shift in this whole system. And Britain and its Brexit, I think the people picked up that actually we need to do our own thing. And I think we're going to see more and more of the European nations following suit. So when that happens, we will see Frexit and Sprexit and Grexit and various exits as people decide that, okay, the European project has served its purpose. Each of us now can live with each other without going to war. And what we'll do is let's make our peace and resolve the atrocities that are part of our history. That baggage has to be shared. This, I feel, could well be a direction that we're all going to move in.
Well, if that should happen, then perhaps the currency also will break up, right? The euro will no longer be the one. They will all go back to the francs and the Deutschmarks and so on and so forth. What do you see?
I have absolutely no idea. I've heard that one of the major banks, one of the very, very large major banks, which is the keystone of the EU, a German bank, the word in German for Germany is Deutsche.
Yes. I can see that you're hesitating to take the name. I was going to say I have read something about Deutsche Bank, but go ahead.
But that's the beginning of a domino effect. Mm-hmm. There is an unsustainable mechanism that has been plaguing the European currency markets for a long time, and I think those chickens are going to come home to roost. And what replaces it, who knows? But there is talk of an African currency coming up. There are cryptocurrencies, which are also becoming very, very much more prevalent, and people are transacting in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So who knows what that holds? But one thing is certain, that those institutions, those elements of infrastructure, which were created during colonial times and which have inherently and intrinsically built into them an element of what's called white privilege in the studies, the academic studies of this phenomenon, I see them all being dismantled. I see them all crumbling and falling to be replaced hopefully by something better. Wiser heads need to get together and do something about that.
Wow. So to a slightly different topic, a global traveler once told me that outside of United States, the only other shining beacon of capitalism is England, and his influence was London's financial markets. Now, there was an exodus 3 years ago when Brexit happened. Do you see those companies like the Goldman Sachs of the world coming back to London to establish their offices again? Or Boris Johnson would have to give them some attractive terms for that to happen? How do you see this financial part play out?
Well, again, I think there is a bigger trend. I think there is a bigger undercurrent that we need to take into account. I remember a Professor Suzuki, a Japanese professor of economics, saying that the manner in which economics is conducted on the planet is plain lunacy. It is crass idiocy. We do not have infinite resources. We live on a little sphere now, and nothing comes from externally. We don't have shipments of minerals being dropped onto the planet. And so to consume them is a fool's recipe. And so the whole of the manner in which the economy of the world operates needs to be changed. We have initiatives like this Extinction Rebellion, which has been bringing London streets to a halt every few weeks. And so the next generation who are coming in, they're looking at everything with a completely different lens. And so if you apply that lens to the manner in which every value seems to be translated into a couple of pieces of paper to be traded on the London Stock Exchange, that's not going to continue. That's completely unsustainable. I'm reminded by something that Gandhiji said when somebody spoke to him about the prospects of India's industrialization. And at that time, the population was about 300 million, I think it was. And he said that his biggest worry was that if 300 million Indians descend upon global resources in the same way as the Western civilizations had consumed them, then there would be nothing left of the earth. He felt that the planet would be in severe danger, and that a dharmic approach, which said that you only consume what you need, and even that with reverence. You know, we have that famous mantra that a traditional Brahmin would invoke in first thing in the morning, Samudra Vasane Devi, where he would pray to the earth and say, I'm going to be stepping on you as I go about my day's duties, and I apologize, and please give me forgiveness for having insulted you by walking on you. Now that is a very eco-friendly way of looking at this earth and the sphere that we're in. I see a transition to that sort of an approach, and I think it will happen so fast. The youngsters are not involved in and not interested in getting mortgages for 30 years to have a little 3-bedroom semi-detached where they're paying basically for the mortgage. They're saying, no, we're not interested. We're going to see the world, we're going to connect with people, and we're going to fix this. So I suspect that the next generation will not be ensnared and entrapped by the manner in which the capitalist markets have sought to exercise control. It's a brave new world, and as Boris Johnson's cabinet has sort of brought us to this frontier, it's going to be an incredible exploration. I'm very, very comfortable and confident with human nature and its divine drivers that we'll find ways in which to overcome the transition. But transitions are never, never easy. The very old established British political infrastructure and the policies of somebody walking down the road with a little gold rod and banging on the door and being rejected and refused. There was a time when those things were really appreciated as history, as part of tradition. But youngsters are saying, well, hang on, why can't you just do it on an iPad? And, you know, we need to get moving with this. They're not so enamored with all of those old things. So all of this change in psychology, this change in values, that's all going to hit all of us, especially Europe, and especially those who have built very large empires on basically obsolete ideologies.
That was a fascinating discussion, Panditji, and thank you very much for that. And we will come back and revisit this maybe a few months down the road to see how it's playing out, because it certainly seems very hopeful. Sometimes people just need hope. And I think Boris Johnson brings hope. And sometimes, you know, that's all you need. And the ship rights itself, and a new England is born. And maybe England becomes the the guiding light for the other European countries to follow. So thank you very much, Panditji.
Oh, there is one thing you just mentioned there that I'd like to touch on. This thing about hope is so critical. And if you think about the Indian diaspora in every country, we are hopeful people, whether it's in Silicon Valley, somehow or other, we have this complete and utter confidence that by putting in efforts, the future will unfold in a manner which is good for everyone. And one thing that Boris Johnson has managed to do is to reignite that aspirational instinct. And that aspirational instinct was missing so much for the last 3 years. Now, he mentioned in his opening speech that Britain's expertise has been in project management, technology, those things which require someone to put together a project plan so refined, so detailed, and so thorough that 300,000 people could actually run a colony of 300 million and administer it and still get away with a profit. Now that takes some serious project planning, and that's, you know, almost it's a genetic ability. Now, if we can harness the capacity to engage and deliver projects that the British have been famous for, I almost said infamous for, famous for, and apply it in a new world, then there is a phenomenal opportunity if we can leverage their capacity for delivering these things to participate in the infrastructure of India, recreating a new India. There's lots of scope for projects and back and forth. But the biggest thing is that we have to be able to have India articulate its dharmic vision. In our Shastra, we say that there is Kam, Arth, then there's Dharma and Moksha. And a person who is stuck in Kam and Arth will always end up suffering and causing harm. Now, from one perspective, we could say that the Western civilization is stuck in Kam and Arth. They have no notion of the third one, which is Dharma, which is how do you actually enjoy the first two without being destroyed? How do you then gravitate towards harmony? Dharma. And Dharma is the next thing that has to be introduced. So if we can have project planning from the West, a dharmic vision from the East, combine, then I think the future could be an extraordinary future.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is just fantastic. Thank you very much, Satishji, and we'll be back with more such illuminating discussions.
It's a pleasure, Ajay, and I look forward to our next conversation with aspiration and with positive expectations.
Thank you very much.
And namaskar.
Namaskar.